Alright, these are group 2 of your evolution vocabulary. We're going to start with fitness. In terms of evolution and biology, fitness does not have to do with strength like we think of like a strong person. Fitness in biology is, and if you couldn't tell, that's a strong muscular arm. Fitness in biology actually has to do with the ability to survive and reproduce. And the longer an organism can survive and the more it can reproduce, the more fit it is. This is where the expression survival of the fittest comes from. So if they're fit, that means they will survive longer and reproduce more. Our next word is going to be speciation, and speciation actually has the word species inside of it, that very first part, the word species, and this is because speciation is actually the formation of new species. And an example of this would be Darwin's finches. So if we remember the story of the finches, they flew from the mainland, so this is the mainland, to this chain of islands that were out in the middle of the ocean. So here's the ocean out here. Now finches are really little birds. They really can't fly over the open ocean, but as they were flying, a storm blew some of the finches to different islands, and so they kind of got trapped there at the different islands. And at one island there was only hard shells of nuts and things to eat, and so the finch had to develop a big strong beak to be able to eat that kind of food. And at another island there were berries and soft foods to eat, so the finch only had to have a little bitty beak to be able to eat that type of food. And there were different versions of beaks here and here at these other islands. And so basically over time we get a new species of finch here, a new species of finch here, and a new species of finch on each island because they've been isolated for so long. And so this formation of these new species of finches is speciation. Okay, our next word is going to be gene pool, and gene pool is basically the idea that you only can combine genes of organisms that live near each other. So let's say that we're looking at an isolated population of people, and all of them have blood type AB. So here's these 3 individuals. Now, no matter how you cross them, you're only going to get combinations of A's and B's. And so their offspring might have type AA, or it might have type BB, or it might be also AB. So no matter how you combine them, you're only going to get A's and B's. You're never going to get a type O blood type from this combination of people. So your gene pool is limited to the actual alleles that the individuals have. In this case, the alleles that they have are A's and B's for blood type. And since they are limited to A's and B's, you're never going to get a type O blood type. You would have to go somewhere else where people with a type O blood type to be able to get that sort of addition to the gene pool. The next word we're going to look at is genetic drift, and genetic drift is probably best explained by an analogy. So let's say that you have 5 paint cans that have red paint in them, and you have 5 paint cans that have white paint in them. And you close your eyes and randomly you're going to fill up some other paint cans that are empty with some combination of these paints. So now you have 10 more paint cans that are empty. And you're going to take some random color, not necessarily fill it up, and you're going to add it to these empty paint cans. And if you do this randomly, you're probably not going to end up with exactly 5 red and 5 white. You might end up with, let's say, 7 red and 3 white. because it was random. And so if you keep doing this over and over and over again, and you each time just close your eyes and pour paint into the paint cans, eventually you're going to end up with all the paint cans full of the same color. And it'll take a long time for this to happen, but eventually this is what you'll end up with. Either they're all full of white paint or they're all full of red paint. And this is what happens in genetic drift. It's saying not necessarily that one trait is better than the other. It's a random process, but just that after combining these genes over and over and over again, eventually one of the genes will be all that's left. And so randomly, one of those genes will be selected, not necessarily because it's better, but just because you've combined them so many times. So that's genetic drift. That's a tough concept. Don't worry if it's a little confusing. Just remember it's a random process. All right, the next one we're going to look at is geographical isolation. And geographical isolation is like the story of the finches. So we had the finches flying over the open ocean to different islands, and each of those islands was separated by lots of ocean. And once the finches got there, they couldn't leave because a finch is a very small bird and it can't survive a flight over the open ocean. And so the finches were geographically isolated, and you couldn't have any interbreeding of finches between islands because they couldn't make the distance to be able to interbreed. And so that's geographical isolation. It's things like mountains and islands that separate organisms from being able to interbreed. The next one we're going to look at is behavioral isolation. And behavioral isolation is similar to geographic isolation in that you can't, it prevents organisms from interbreeding, but this is to do with behavior rather than some kind of boundary. And so if you think about it, behavioral isolation is kind of like a bird that has some kind of mating ritual that it does. So let's say that this bird does a little dance and builds a special kind of nest to attract a mate. But another bird, when it sees that dance that it does, and it sees the nest, it doesn't recognize what it's doing. And so it doesn't realize that it's trying to attract a mate. It's not going to be attracted. And so there's no interbreeding that's going to go on. So that behavioral isolation comes in that this bird is doing something that doesn't make sense to the other bird. And because it can't attract a mate that way, that means there won't be any interbreeding. And so often this separates species from interbreeding because of their behavior. And this can lead to further evolution of the species because they won't interbreed, so they'll continue to evolve on their own as individual species.